There is a door in the east corridor of the station that I have walked past 412 times. I counted because counting is what you do up here. Counting is how you keep your mind from sliding off the edge of itself in the dark months. 412 times I walked past that door, and 411 times it opened into a supply closet. Shelving. Antifreeze. A dead space heater nobody had bothered to throw out. The 412th time, it opened into a room I had never seen. It was warm. That was the first wrong thing. Nothing in northern Alaska is warm in February, not even the parts of the station closest to the generators. But this room was warm in the way a waiting room at a clinic is warm, that thick, recycled, slightly stale heat, the kind that smells faintly of dust burning on a radiator. There were chairs. 6 of them, the molded plastic kind, bolted to a steel rail along the wall. A low table with magazines on it, their covers faded to the color of weak tea. A fluorescent light overhead, one tube of it flickering at a rhythm that did not match electricity. And there was a window. The station has no east-facing window in that corridor. I know the building. I helped seal 2 of the window frames myself in November when the cold started getting in. But this window looked out onto something. Not the tundra. Not the snow. It looked out onto a parking lot under a gray sky, the kind of parking lot you'd find behind a regional hospital in Ohio, with painted lines and a single car and a streetlight that was on even though it was daytime. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I did not go in. Some animal part of my brain, the part that is older than language, planted its feet and refused. And then I heard, from one of the chairs I could not quite see from the angle of the door, somebody shift their weight. The plastic creaked. A throat cleared softly, the way people do in waiting rooms when they have been waiting a long time and have stopped expecting their name to be called. I closed the door. When I opened it again, and I made myself open it again, because I needed it to be the closet, I needed that more than I have ever needed anything, it was the closet. Shelving. Antifreeze. The dead space heater. I want to tell you that's the worst of it. I want to tell you that was the strangest thing that happened to me at Station Kelvin 9. It wasn't. My name doesn't matter for this. They told us that during orientation, actually in those exact words. Your name doesn't matter for this. I thought it was a joke about the bureaucracy, about being a number in a federal weather contract. It wasn't a joke. Almost nothing they told me was a joke, I would learn, but it took me a long time to understand which things were warnings. I came up in late September, which is the last month they fly the small planes in before the season closes the sky. The flight from Fairbanks was 2 hours northeast over country that stopped looking like anything a person could live in about 20 minutes after takeoff. Just white gold tundra going gray, then black water lakes scattered like broken glass, then the foothills, then nothing. The pilot didn't talk much. When I asked him how long he'd been flying the route, he said, "Long enough." And that was the whole conversation. The station sits on a low rise above a river valley that has no name on any map I've ever found. There are 4 buildings connected by enclosed corridors. They call them the spans, so that in the deep winter you never have to step outside between them. The main building holds the control room, the equipment bays, the radio, the logging stations. The second building is the dormitory. The third is the generator hall and water plant. The 4th building is locked. I was told it held legacy equipment, and that nobody had the key, which I accepted, because when you arrive somewhere remote you accept almost everything for the first few weeks. Acceptance is how you survive the adjustment. By the time your skepticism comes back online, you're already part of it. There were 6 of us when I arrived. Let me tell you about them the way I understood them at the time, before I understood anything. Dahl was the station chief. Older, maybe 60, with a face like something carved out of driftwood and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like it was being read off a clipboard even when it wasn't. He'd been at Kelvin 9 for 19 winters. 19. When he told me that, I laughed, because I thought no one could do 19 winters in a place like this and stay whole, and he looked at me with a patience that I now understand was not patience at all. Reyes ran the equipment. She was the most normal person there, or she seemed it, Which is maybe why what happened to her bothered me the most. She had a daughter back in Anchorage, and she counted the days until rotation the way I counted the times I passed that door. She taught me the logging procedures. She was kind to me. I want that written down somewhere. There was Petrov, who handled the radio and barely spoke to anyone, and Okafor, who did maintenance, and a thin pale man everyone called Sully who I never learned the real name of and who I am not sure, looking back, was entirely there. And there was me. The new one. The replacement. I didn't ask who I was replacing. That was my first real mistake, though it wouldn't have changed anything. There's a tendency, when you take a remote posting, not to ask about the person whose bed you're sleeping in. You assume rotation. You assume a contract ended. You don't assume anything else, because the other things you might assume are not things you want to carry into a place you can't leave for 8 months. The job, at first, was exactly what they advertised. You log temperatures every hour on the hour, from the instrument array on the rise. You monitor the radar and the satellite downlinks for storm systems forming over the Beaufort Sea and tracking inland. You maintain the equipment, which in that cold means a constant slow war against ice and metal fatigue. You relay your reports south twice a day on a schedule so rigid that Dahl would knock on your door if you were 30 seconds late to the radio. And you survive. That last one isn't written in the manual, but it's the real job. Everything else is just structure built around the surviving. I'll be honest about the isolation, because I think people who haven't done it imagine it wrong. They imagine loneliness, and loneliness is part of it, but loneliness is a feeling and you can manage feelings. What they don't imagine is the silence. The tundra in winter is the quietest place I have ever been. When the wind dies, and it does die, for hours at a stretch in the deep cold, the silence has a physical weight to it. You can hear your own heartbeat. You can hear the blood in your ears, a soft roar, like a seashell held against your head, except it never stops, because it's coming from inside you. Some nights I'd stand in the span between the main building and the dorm just to hear the structure tick and settle, just to hear something that wasn't my own body reminding me it was there. And into that silence the station made its sounds. The generators, a low industrial hum you stopped hearing after a day and started hearing again every time you got scared. The radio static, which was constant, a soft hiss under everything, because Petrov kept the band open even when there was nothing to receive. The wind in the instrument array, which made a sound like distant voices if you let it, and you learned very quickly not to let it. For the first 3 weeks, nothing was wrong. I want to be precise about that, because the wrongness, when it came, did not announce itself. It seeped in. It was already there, I think, the whole time, and I just hadn't learned to see it yet, the way you don't see the pattern in wallpaper until one day you can't see anything else. The first thing I noticed, and at the time I didn't even notice it as a thing, it just sat in the back of my head like a splinter you don't know you have until it gets infected, was the way they handled certain storms. Reyes was training me on the logging protocol. There's a standard form, federal, that's been used for decades. You fill it in by hand because the cold kills tablets, and the procedure predates them anyway. Date, time, system designation, pressure, wind, precipitation type, etc. Every storm system that crosses your monitoring zone gets a designation, a name, basically, though they're not names, they're alphanumeric codes, and that designation follows it through every report until it dissipates or leaves your zone. About a week in, a system formed off the coast. I watched it on radar, a tight little spiral of moisture organizing itself over the water, and I started a log for it the way I'd been taught. I was halfway through assigning it a designation when Reyes put her hand flat over my form. "Not that one," she said. I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the radar. "It's a system," I said. "It's tracking inland. That's the protocol, right? I logged it." "Not that one," she said again, and her voice was completely flat, and that flatness was the first genuinely frightening thing I encountered at Kelvin 9, though it would be weeks before I understood why. She took my form, the half-filled one, and she didn't crumple it or file it. She fed it into the shredder by the door. Then she gave me a fresh form and she said, Log the next one. I logged the next one. The little spiral on the radar tightened and darkened and came ashore sometime that night, and I never wrote a single word about it, and in the morning the radar was clear and Reyes was making coffee in the galley and humming, and I told myself I had misunderstood the protocol. That's what you do the first time. You tell yourself you misunderstood. Here is something about the human mind that I learned at that station and that I wish I could unlearn. It will accept almost anything if the acceptance is gradual enough and everyone around you is already accepting it. The unlogged storms became routine. Not common, most systems got logged normally, designated, reported, filed. But every so often, maybe 1 in 8, 1 in 10, a storm would form and Dahl or Reyes or Petrov would say, quietly, "Not that one." And that storm would simply not exist. No form. No designation. No report south. The radar tracked it, the instruments measured it, but officially, on paper, it never happened. I started keeping count, in my head, because counting is what I do. By December I had 31 unlogged storms. I want to describe how you tell the difference, because at first I couldn't, and then I could, and the fact that I could is part of what broke something in me. The logged storms behaved like weather. They had fronts, they had pressure gradients, they moved the way air moves, governed by physics I'd studied in school. You could predict them. You could feel them coming in your sinuses, in the old ache of a bone you broke as a kid. The unlogged ones didn't behave like weather. They were too organized. They held their shape too well, those tight dark spirals, holding their form for hundreds of miles over terrain that should have torn them apart. And they came in too slowly. A normal storm crosses your zone in hours. These would take their time. They'd sit offshore for a day, 2 days, as if they were waiting for something, and then they'd come ashore at night. Always at night. And the instruments did strange things when they were close. The barometer would drop the way it should in a low-pressure system, but then it would keep dropping, past anything I'd ever seen, down into numbers that according to my training should have meant we were standing at the bottom of the ocean, and the building would creak, and my ears would pop, and then it would snap back to normal in a single instant, like an elastic band released. The thermometers would disagree with each other, the one on the north mass reading 40 below, the one on the south mass reading near freezing, 50 feet apart, no wind to explain it. The radar would show returns where there was nothing, dense returns, solid, the kind you'd get from a mountain, except they moved slowly, against the wind. I asked Reyes about the moving returns once. She was at the equipment bench, recalibrating a sensor, and I described what I'd seen, the dense slow returns moving against the wind, and I watched her hands go still on the sensor. Not stop, go still, the way a rabbit goes still. "Ground clutter," she said. "Ground clutter doesn't move," I said. "Up here it does," she said, and she went back to the sensor, and that was the end of it. The radio got strange around the same time. Petrov ran the radio, and the radio ran on a schedule, and the schedule was sacred. South contact at 0600 and 1800, a regional relay station we knew only by its call sign, a flat board voice that took our reports and gave us nothing back but weather advisories and the occasional administrative notice. Between those windows the band stayed open, hissing, and Petrov sat with it like a man fishing a frozen lake, waiting for something to bite. In December, things started coming through the band that shouldn't have. The first time, I was in the radio room keeping Petrov company on a long dark afternoon. We did that, sometimes, sat together without talking, because being alone in the dark months is a particular kind of poison, and we all knew it. The band was hissing. And then, under the hiss, faint, there was a voice. It wasn't the relay station. The relay station was a man. This was a voice I couldn't assign a gender to, slow and even, and it was reading numbers. Just numbers. 4, 9, 4, 7, 1. A pause. 4, 9, 4, 7, 1. The same 5 numbers, over and over, with the same pause between repetitions, the same flat even tone. I'd read about number stations before. Cold War relics, shortwave broadcasts of coded numbers for spies. I said as much to Petrov, almost relieved, almost glad to have a normal explanation. Number station, I said. Right? That's all that is. Petrov reached over and turned the dial, slowly, off the frequency. The numbers stayed. He turned it further. The numbers stayed, at exactly the same volume, on every frequency, as if they weren't coming through the radio at all but through the air around it. He switched the radio off. The numbers stayed, for 3 more seconds, in the silence of the dead radio. 4, 9, 4, 7, 1. And then they stopped, mid-sequence, cut off after the 7, and the silence came back, and Petrov sat very still, and then he turned the radio back on and the band hissed normally and he said, "You should go log the 1800 temps." I went and logged the temps. My hands shook so badly I had to write the numbers twice. The memory thing started in December too. Or maybe it had started earlier and December is just when I noticed it, the way I noticed everything too late. I would lose time. Small amounts at first. I'd be walking from the dorm to the main building through the span, a walk of maybe 90 seconds, and I'd arrive in the control room with no memory of the last half of the walk, and the clock would say 6 minutes had passed. I'd be filling out a log and look down and find writing in my own hand that I didn't remember writing, numbers that were correct, in the right boxes, but with no memory of the act of writing them. I asked the others if this happened to them. I asked it carefully, casually, the way you ask about a symptom you're afraid is serious. Reyes said, "It's the dark. The dark does that. You'll get used to it." Dahl said nothing, just looked at me with that patience that wasn't patience. Sully, the thin pale man, Sully laughed, a small private laugh, and said, "You're starting to keep their time," and walked away before I could ask what that meant. I lay awake that night, in the deep silence, listening to my own blood, and I thought, keep their time. And I did not let myself wonder who they were, because some part of me already knew that wondering was the first step toward a place I might not come back from. The safety routines were the thing I should have run from. I see that now. They were so strange, so specific, and everyone performed them with such unthinking habit, that I should have understood immediately that they were not safety routines at all but something older, something that had ossified into ritual. When an unlogged storm was coming, and we always knew, hours ahead, from the slow dark spiral offshore, Dahl would walk the station and check the doors. Not lock them. Check them. He'd open every interior door, look inside, and close it again. Every door. The supply closets, the bathrooms, the equipment bays. I asked him what he was checking for and he said, "Making sure they're rooms." I thought I'd misheard. I asked again. He said, "Making sure they're the rooms they're supposed to be." And he moved on to the next door, and I thought of the waiting room, the warm room with the chairs and the window, and I felt the floor of my stomach drop. We covered the windows. All of them, with these heavy quilted panels that hung on hooks, and we were never to uncover them while a storm was passing, and we were never, ever, to look out. Reyes told me this part directly, gripping my arm, the only time she ever touched me. "During those storms," she said, "you do not look outside. If you hear something outside, you do not look. If someone outside calls your name, you do not look. There is no one outside. Do you understand me? There is never anyone outside." I said I understood. I didn't. But I said it. And we paired off. During an unlogged storm, no one was ever alone. You slept in shifts, 2 to a room, 1 awake. The one awake had one job, to make sure the other one didn't get up and walk somewhere in their sleep. Sully told me once, in his flat strange way, that the storms called people, and that people who were alone answered, and that the ones who answered didn't come back the same, if they came back. The first time I asked who had answered, the room got cold. Not metaphorically. The temperature dropped, I watched my breath appear, and the conversation ended, and we never spoke of it again. But I'd seen, by then, the dormitory. 11 beds. 6 people. I started wondering who'd slept in the empty 5. In late January the storm came that should not have existed. I knew it was wrong before it appeared on radar. We all did. The barometer started its slow, impossible fall 2 full days before there was anything to see, and the generators developed a new sound, a low cyclical groan under their hum, like something heavy turning over in its sleep. The silence got worse. I know that sounds impossible. How does silence get worse? But it did. It got thicker. It started to feel less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something that was eating sound, sitting over the station and drinking it down. And the animals left. I hadn't even realized there were animals. You don't see much wildlife in the deep winter, but there were ravens, a few, that lived around the generator hall where the warmth leaked out, and they'd been there since I arrived, and one morning they were gone. All of them, at once. Okafor noticed it first. He came into the galley white-faced and said, "The birds are gone." And Dahl set down his coffee very slowly and said, "How long do we have?" And Okafor said, "I don't know. A day. Less." It came onto the radar that night. The tightest, darkest spiral I had ever seen, so organized it looked artificial, a logo, a symbol. It sat offshore. And it was big. It filled the screen, edge to edge, in a way no storm should, because the screen represented hundreds of miles and no storm is hundreds of miles of solid return, but this one was a single mass, turning slowly, against the wind, the way they always turned. Dahl walked the station and checked the doors. He was gone a long time. When he came back he was carrying his arm strangely, holding it against his chest, and I asked if he was hurt, and he looked at me and said, "The East Corridor closet is the waiting room again. Don't go in the East Corridor." I felt the blood leave my face. "What waiting room?" I said, even though I knew, even though I had seen it, because I wanted so badly for him to not know what I knew. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. Most people see it once before they understand. It's a kind of test, I think. Or an invitation. The room shows up between places that aren't supposed to connect, a closet here, a hallway there. It's the same room every time. The chairs. The window. Have you seen the window? I nodded. I couldn't speak. "Don't ever go in," he said. "And don't ever sit down." He didn't explain. None of them ever explained anything fully. I understand now that it wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't even secrecy. Not exactly. It was that they didn't have the words. You can't explain a thing you don't understand. You can only describe what it does, and warn people, and hope. The storm came ashore at 0300, and the equipment started lying. That's the only way I can describe it. The instruments didn't break. Broken instruments give you nothing, or they give you obvious garbage. These gave us readings. Clean, precise, confident readings. And they were wrong in ways that suggested intelligence. The way a child's lie is more disturbing than their silence because it shows they understand the truth well enough to invert it. The thermometers all read the same now. Exactly the same, to the 100th of a degree, every sensor across the array, which is physically impossible. The barometer settled at a number that meant nothing, not high, not low, just a value that wasn't on any scale I recognized, and it held there, perfectly steady, while the building creaked and my ears ached. The radars showed the storm sitting directly over us, but it also showed, in the center of the spiral, a clear circle. An eye. And in the eye returns. Structured returns. Lines and angles. It looked, and I will never forget this, it looked like a building. Like a floor plan. Like rooms. Reyes saw me looking at it, and turned the radar off. "Don't read the eye," she said. We covered the windows. We paired off. I was paired with Reyes, which I was glad of, because of all of them she was the most human, and I needed human badly. We took the dorm room with the 2 beds against the east wall. She took first watch. I tried to sleep. I want to tell you about the sounds, because the sounds are the part one still hear. The wind first. But it wasn't wind. Wind is chaos, wind gusts and dies and changes. This was rhythmic. It rose and fell in long slow cycles, 12 seconds up, 12 seconds down, and after a while I realized, and this is when I started crying, quietly, so Reyes wouldn't hear. I realized it was breathing. The storm was breathing. The whole structure of the station rose and fell with it, the windows flexing in their covered frames, the air pressure in the room swelling and ebbing in time, and I lay there matching my own breath to it without meaning to, and Reyes reached over in the dark and gripped my wrist, hard, and whispered, "Don't breathe with it. Breathe against it. Whatever you do, don't fall into its rhythm." I breathed against it. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, breathing against something that wanted, with everything it had, for me to breathe with it. And then, under the breathing, the other sounds. Footsteps in the snow, outside, slow and deliberate, circling the building. Not animal footsteps. Bipedal. Patient. They'd come close to the wall and stop, right outside where my head was, and there'd be a silence, a listening silence, and then they'd move on. And voices. Calling names? Not my name, at first. They called Okafor, in a voice that sounded exactly like Reyes, and they called Petrov, in a voice that sounded exactly like Dal, and I understood that the thing outside was learning us, trying our voices on each other, seeing which combinations might work. And then, near dawn, though there was no dawn, just a degree less black, it called my name. In my mother's voice. My mother who died when I was 19. I have never told anyone that. It wasn't in my file. There is no way anything at that station could have known my mother's voice. But there it was, outside the covered window by my head, my mother's voice, exactly hers, the particular way she said my name when she was tired, and it said, "It's so cold out here. Won't you let me in?" I did not look. I did not move. I lay there with my eyes shut and tears running into my ears, and I breathed against the storm, and I did not answer, and after a while, minutes, hours, I lost time, I lost so much time, the voice stopped. And the footsteps stopped. And the breathing slowed. In the morning, Reyes was asleep in her chair, which meant for some part of the night no one had been on watch, and I had no memory of the watch passing to me, and there was mud on the floor by the door. Not snow. Mud. Wet black mud, in the shape of a footprint, pointing inward toward my bed. There is no mud in northern Alaska in January. The ground is frozen 6 feet down. I cleaned it up before Reyes woke. I don't know why. I think I didn't want her to confirm it was real. The fourth building. The locked one. Legacy equipment, no key. I found the key 3 days after the storm, and I want to be clear that I didn't find it by accident, and I want to be clear that I have asked myself 1,000 times whether finding it was my idea or whether the station fed it to me, the way it fed Doll the warning about the closet, the way it fed me the room with the chairs. The key was in my own pocket. I don't know how it got there. I don't remember picking it up. But I lost time. I'd been losing more and more time since the storm, whole hours now, sometimes finding myself in parts of the station I didn't remember walking to, and I came back to myself one afternoon standing in the span outside the fourth building with a brass key in my hand, an old key, the warm dull brass of something made decades ago, and the door in front of me, and the key fit the door. And I understand that this is the part of the story where a reasonable person turns around. I'm not telling you I was reasonable. The fourth building was cold. Colder than outside somehow, a cold that didn't come from the air but seemed to come up out of the floor. There was equipment, like they'd said, but it wasn't weather equipment. Or it was, but it was old, decades old, and it had been repurposed. There were antenna arrays pointed not at the sky but at the ground, at the river valley below the rise. There were seismographs, their needles tracing slow regular waves across paper drums even though there was no earthquake, even though the ground was solid frozen rock, the needles tracing that same 12-second rhythm I knew now in my bones, the breathing rhythm. The building had been listening to something underground. Or something the storms brought. I'm not sure there's a difference. And there were the records. A whole room of them, file cabinets floor to ceiling, decades of paper. The unlogged storms. Every one that was never reported south, going back. I checked the dates, going back 60 years. before the station was officially a weather station. The earliest files were on a different letterhead, an agency I didn't recognize, the kind of name that's deliberately boring so you won't look at it twice. The storms had names in these files. Real names, not designations. Whoever started this had named them, the way you name things you're afraid of to make them smaller, and it hadn't worked. You could tell it hadn't worked because the handwriting got worse over the decades, the careful early script degrading into a shaking scrawl. And there were personnel files. The people who'd worked here. 60 years of them. And I started reading them, and I started to understand the empty beds in the dormitory, the ones I'd wondered about. People didn't leave Kelvin 9. Not most of them. The files used a word over and over, a clinical word, attrition, but attrition is a word that hides things. Some of them had simply stopped being recorded, last entry, a date, then nothing, no transfer, no return south, just a name that stops. Some of them had longer files. Notes. Observations. Subject reports recurring dreams of a waiting room. Subject has begun breathing in synchronization with low-frequency atmospheric oscillation. Subject no longer responds to given name. Subject answered the window. That phrase again. Answered the window. There was a file with my name on it. It was thick. Far thicker than 3 months of employment should produce. I opened it, and the early pages were normal. My application, my background, my training records. And then the entries kept going, past the present, dated in the future, in handwriting I recognized as my own. Observations about myself, written by myself, that I had no memory of writing. Subject is keeping their time now. Subject has stopped counting the door. I had stopped counting the door. I realized it in that moment. I hadn't counted my passes in weeks. I didn't know the number anymore. And the last entry, dated 8 months in the future, in my handwriting, said, "Subject is ready to wait." I heard the door of the building open behind me. It was Dahl. He looked at the file in my hands and he didn't get angry. He just looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen a person look, and he said, "You found your file. What is this place?" I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "It's exactly what they told you it is," he said. "It's a weather station. We monitor the storms. We just don't only monitor the weather." He came and stood beside me and looked at the file cabinets, 60 years of them. "Something comes through with certain storms. Has for longer than this station's been here. The locals knew about it before there were any maps. It doesn't come from the sky and it doesn't come from the ground, it comes from between. The space between places. That's why the room shows up where it does. In the closet, the corridor. It's a doorway looking for a door. What does it want?" I said. He thought about this for a long time. The seismograph needles scratched their 12-second rhythm. "I don't think it wants," he finally said. "I think wanting is a thing we do. I think it just connects. It connects places that aren't supposed to connect. And people. It found a way in, a long time ago, through the storms, and the only thing anyone's ever figured out how to do is watch it, and not look at it, and not answer it, and keep it off the official record so nobody comes looking, because the people who came looking, in the early years," he gestured at the cabinets, "they're in there too. And the censoring," I said. "The unlogged storms. That's not protocol. That's the whole job," he said. "The weather is the cover. The reports we send south are the cover. The real job is that somebody has to be here when those storms come, somebody has to not answer the window, because if there's nobody here to not answer..." He stopped. "It's been answered before. When there was nobody here to refuse it. It doesn't go well. Things connect that shouldn't. The room gets bigger. It needs people in the chairs." I thought about the throat clearing. The shift of weight in the chair I couldn't see. Someone, already, waiting. "Who's in the chairs?" I asked. Dahl didn't answer that. He took the file out of my hands, gently, and he put it back in the drawer, and he said, "Reyes is your relief tonight. Don't be alone." And he walked me out of the building, and he locked it, and I never saw the key again, and I have wondered ever since whether it's back in my pocket, waiting, and I have been afraid to check. I should tell you what happened to Reyes, because I promised to write her name down, and because it's the part that I think finally broke whatever was left of my certainty about what's real. Reyes was counting the days. She had a calendar, paper, taped inside her locker, and every night she crossed off a day, and she was down to 41 days until rotation, until she'd see her daughter. She showed me a photograph once. A girl, maybe 8, gap-toothed, on a swing. The night after I found the files, a small storm came in. A real one, a logged one, ordinary weather. We didn't even cover the windows. And in the middle of that ordinary harmless night, Reyes got up and walked into the east corridor. I followed her. I don't know why I woke, but I woke, and her bed was empty, and I followed her, and the door of the east corridor closet was open, and warm light was spilling out of it, that thick recycled clinic warmth, and Reyes was standing in the doorway looking in. "Reyes," I said. She turned and looked at me and her face was calm. Calmer than I'd ever seen her. The 41 days were gone from her face. She said, "She's in there. My daughter. She's been waiting so long. Look." And she pointed into the room, at the chairs, and I made the mistake, the only time, I made the mistake and I looked. There was a child in one of the chairs. Small. Gap-toothed. On the low table in front of her, instead of the faded magazines, there was a photograph, and it was the same photograph Reyes had shown me, the girl on the swing, except in this one the swing was empty. "Reyes," I said, "your daughter's in Anchorage. She's alive. She's in Anchorage." And Reyes looked at me with that terrible calm and said, "Then who's been waiting?" And she stepped into the room and sat down in the chair next to the child. I want to tell you I pulled her out. I want to tell you I was brave. But the moment she sat down the door began to close, on its own, slow and gentle, and the warmth and the light narrowed to a line and then to nothing, and when I opened the door again, and I made myself open it, it was the closet. Shelving. Antifreeze. The dead space heater. No Reyes. In the morning there were 5 of us, and no one mentioned her, and when I screamed at Doll about it he held my shoulders and said, very quietly, "There were always 5 of us. Think. Has there ever been anyone else?" And I looked at the others, at Petrov and Okafor and Sully, and they looked back at me with mild concern, and I could feel my certainty coming loose. I could feel the memory of Reyes starting to soften at the edges like ice in spring, and I clung to it. I clung to the photograph of the girl on the swing, and I said her name out loud over and over so I wouldn't lose it. Her name was Reyes. She had a daughter in Anchorage. I am writing it down. She was real. She was kind to me. I am writing it down because I am afraid that if I don't, I'll do what the station wants, which is to let her become one of the empty beds, one of the names that just stops. But here is the thing I can't get past, the thing that sits in me like cold water. Her locker. The next day I opened her locker, to find the calendar, the photograph, proof. The locker was empty. Clean. Like no one had ever used it. And taped inside the door, where her calendar should have been, was a calendar in my handwriting, counting down my own days, and 41 of them were already crossed off, and I did not remember crossing off a single one. I survived the winter. I want to say that plainly, because it's true, and because so much of what I've told you isn't the kind of thing you can be sure of, and I want to give you at least one solid fact to hold on to. The planes came back in May, the sky opened, and I flew out of Kelvin 9 alive. But I don't think I survived all of it. I think part of me is still there. I think part of me is in one of the chairs. The last storm, the big one's smaller siblings kept coming through February and March, and we did the routines, covered the windows, paired off, breathed against them, didn't look, didn't answer. The last storm passed in early April, and like all of them it passed without acknowledgement. No report went south. No record was kept. The next morning the radar was clear and the sun came up for real for the first time in months, and the light was so bright on the snow it hurt to look at, and Doll made coffee and Petrov ran the 0600 contact, and the flat board voice from the south took our ordinary weather report, and gave us nothing back, and it was as if none of it had ever happened. That's the part that stays with me. Not the footsteps, or the voices, or the room. The silence after. The institutional, total, bureaucratic silence. Somewhere south of us there are filing cabinets with 60 years of ordinary weather data from Kelvin 9, neat and complete and entirely false, and no one will ever know what's missing from them, because the whole point is that the missing parts leave no hole. The censorship is perfect. The thing in the storms is real, and it is old, and it comes through, and the only evidence is a building full of files that no one will ever read and a row of empty beds and the people like me who carry it out in our heads and can't prove a word. I went south. I tried to find Reyes's daughter, in Anchorage. I want to tell you I found her, alive, 8 years old, gap-toothed, and that the room had lied. I want that more than I can say. I couldn't find any record of Reyes at all. No employment file with the contractor. No address in Anchorage. No daughter. When I described her to the contractor's office, the woman on the phone was very kind and very patient, and told me that Kelvin 9 had a crew of 5 that winter, and she read me the names, and Reyes was not among them, and my name was, and I asked her to read my name again, slowly, and as she read it I had the sensation, I still have it sometimes, that the name belonged to someone else, someone I was only borrowing it from. Someone sitting very still in a warm room with faded magazines, waiting for it to be called. I don't sleep well. That's ordinary, I suppose, for what I went through, except I'm not sure what I went through, and that's the part no one understands. My memory of that winter has holes in it that I can feel but can't see into, like a tongue finding the gap where a tooth used to be. I remember the routines perfectly. I remember the cold. But the order of things slips. Sometimes I think I arrived in September, and sometimes I'm certain I've been at that station for 19 winters, and I have to look at my hands, my young hands, to be sure. Here is the last thing, and then I'll stop, because I don't think the story really ends. I think it just stops being told, the way those personnel files just stopped. Last week I was in a hospital. Routine, a checkup, nothing serious. And I was walking down a corridor looking for the right department, and I was tired, and I lost time, the way I do, and I came back to myself standing in front of a door I didn't remember walking to. It was a waiting room. Of course it was a waiting room. Hospitals are full of them. Molded plastic chairs bolted to a rail. A low table with faded magazines. A fluorescent tube overhead flickering at a rhythm that did not match electricity. And a window, looking out on a parking lot under a gray sky, a single car, a street light on in the daytime. The same room. The exact same room. And there were people in the chairs. Waiting, the way people wait, having stopped expecting their name to be called. And one of them, near the back, in a chair I could only half see, shifted her weight, and the plastic creaked, and she cleared her throat softly, and I knew before she turned, that it was Reyes, and that she had been waiting all this time, and that there was an empty chair beside her. A nurse touched my elbow and said, "Sir? Are you waiting for someone?" And I almost said yes. The word was right there. Yes. I'm waiting. It would have been so easy, so warm, to go in and sit down, and I understand now that this is all it ever wanted, that wanting is a thing we do, that the room doesn't take you, it just opens, and you answer, the way Reyes answered, the way 60 years of names answered, the way my own handwriting promised I would answer 8 months from a winter that's already past. I said no. I said I wasn't waiting for anyone. I walked out of the hospital and I didn't look back, because if you don't look and you don't answer, it can't connect. That's the only rule that's ever worked, the only thing 60 years of those files ever figured out. But the room is patient. It appears between locations not meant to connect, and everywhere is between somewhere, and I am so tired, and some nights I can feel myself keeping their time, the 12-second rhythm coming up through the floor of wherever I am, breathing, slow, and I have to lie very still and breathe against it. I'm writing this down so that someone knows. So that if my name becomes one of the ones that just stops, you'll understand it didn't stop. It moved. It's in a chair, in a warm room, with a window, waiting for itself to be called. If you ever pass a door that should open onto one thing and opens onto another, a closet that's a waiting room, a corridor that's a window onto a parking lot far away, don't go in. And if there's someone in the chairs who knows your name, who has been waiting so long, who only wants you to sit down where it's warm, don't look. Don't answer. There is never anyone there. There was never anyone there at all.